As the official garden fairy, it was Gwendolyn's job to search and find nasty petal-eating caterpillars and flower-choking weeds, and even to find weakened stems that needed to be supported, not human babies. And that's exactly what she found that morning in her flower garden. How perfectly precious! I had no idea they grew in flower gardens. Well, despite the fact that Gwendolyn had lived her long fairy life near humans, first in the meadow and then in the cottage owned by the widow woman, she knew very little about humans. Well, she knew that there had been 5 children born and raised in the cottage of the widow woman. The man had died when the children were still young. The woman buried him beneath a weeping willow tree, watered the tree with her tears. That's when Gwendolyn started calling her the widow woman. Well, the children grew up and one by one left the cottage. All there was left was the silent widow woman, their empty cottage, and the flower garden, which had never until today sprouted a baby. Gwendolyn hovered over the baby wrapped in a coarse white blanket and looked down into the face of the sweetest human baby girl she had ever seen. Of course, it was the first human baby girl she had ever seen, but she was sure it was the sweetest. Finders, keepers, she shouted as she flew around the baby 3 times. Losers, weepers. Now, as all fairies know, that saying relates to the legend of the human princess with a heart of stone. Once upon a time, there was a princess who felt no love, no sorrow, no joy, no regret. She had unjustly been cursed by an evil witch who had stolen her heart and replaced it with a stone. The king's soldiers searched for years for the princess's heart, but never found it. Then one day, a small garden fairy who had befriended the princess when she was a child came and made a promise. I will find your heart or die trying. And so she searched the entire kingdom, every village, farm, field, and forest, but never found the heart. Defeated and dying, she flew back to the outstretched hand of the princess and collapsed. Cradling the tiny fairy to her heart, for the first time since she had been cursed, the princess began to cry, not for herself, but for her fairy friend. And as her tears dripped over her heart, there was a loud crack, and the princess rocked. Her stone heart had split open, revealing her true heart, which had been hiding magically within. Those loving tears which had opened her heart and released it also healed the fairy. And those tears turned into tiny little pearls called weepers, which were given to the fairy as a reward for helping the princess find her heart. Or a heart may be hurt or even grow cold and hard, but it can never be stolen. And from that day on, if someone found something that had been lost or abandoned, well, the finder could keep that thing if they shouted, finders keepers, losers weepers. Knowing all this, Gwendolyn was very confident that as the finder of the loser baby, she could keep the child as her weeper, a reward. She was less confident about how she was going to move that huge baby into her tiny home underneath the mushroom. What in heaven's name is this? Gwendolyn looked up into the face of the widow woman. Oh, why did they have to shout so? The widow woman, who did not believe in magic or fairies, of course did not see Gwendolyn, but she did see a baby on the ground, which she picked up and took toward her cottage. Gwendolyn called, "No, wait, that's my baby!" And she flew after, but the widow woman closed the door. Gwendolyn flew around to a side window that was open just a crack and snuck in. She was amazed as she watched the widow woman gently unwrap the baby and clean it. Well, I wouldn't have been able to do that very easily, she thought. And well, then the woman got a baby bottle, filled it with milk from a pitcher, and began feeding the baby. Well, it would have taken me all day to collect enough dewdrops to feed the child, but I would have done it. Gwendolyn sat down to think. Now, thinking is not something that fairies do. No. Sing and dance, yes, lots. But stopping long enough to think, no. Only when there was an extraordinary situation would they think. This was an extraordinary situation. So as she sat, she stood up and addressed the widow woman. Human, I want you to know that that is my child, but I will allow you to raise her because I see that you do remember how to raise human children, and your ginormous size is an advantage. You may even name the child and call her your own, but know in your heart, she is my child. And she flew out the window. The next morning, Gwendolyn flew back in the window and landed on the tummy of her sleeping child. Wake up, my child. Baby opened her little eyes and smiled at the tiny fairy. I am your true mother because of the finders, keepers, losers, weepers law. I am allowing that huge human to raise you, but you are my child. She made a promise that she would come every morning at dawn before the widow woman woke up, and that would be their special mother-child time. She would teach her child all the fairy stories and songs and even share her love of nature and flowers. Because a fairy always keeps a promise. That is exactly what she did every morning. Until one frosty morning, when she came to the window, it was shut. Gwendolyn stood outside pounding on the glass. The baby woke up and started screaming. The widow woman ran and picked up the baby. Oh, Melissa, oh goodness, what is going on? Oh, the baby seemed to be reaching its little hands out toward the window, and the widow woman walked over. Well, there's nothing out there. She turned her back to the window and to Gwendolyn. The baby cried even louder. And then, startled, the widow woman heard a wee voice. Leave the window open, just a crack. I'm hearing fairy voices again. Oh, that's seems every time I do, though, what person says, or it turns out to be true. Like the time I bent down to pick a pansy and someone yelled, snake. That was me. I warned you. You heard me? Oh, I had no idea. Perhaps you're not quite as dense as I had thought you were. As Gwendolyn reevaluated the intelligence level of humankind, the widow woman walked over and opened the window, just a crack. As soon as she did, Melissa stopped crying. She closed her tiny eyes. The widow woman kissed her on the forehead and put her in the cradle. From that day on, Melissa's window was open every day, just a crack. Days passed and Gwendolyn grew and blossomed just like the flower garden did. Gwendolyn was so happy with Melissa, or her child, that happiness just spilled out into her flower fairy duties. And they spent so much time learning their stories that even during the night, when Melissa sat on the floor at her human mother's feet, she would entertain her with stories, outrageous stories about fairies and elves, and she would even do performances. She would sing songs and do dances that she said her other married mother, her fairy mother, taught her. The widow woman smiled and laughed, and she never encouraged such talk. She never discouraged it either. But every night, Melissa's window was left open, just a crack. Time passed for a fairy. One day is like 1 year, is like 18 years, and she had noticed that Gwendolyn's body was getting larger, and Gwendolyn seemed to be less interested in their time spent together. She had even started ignoring their morning time and sleeping through. But fairies always keep their promise, and every morning at dawn, she would come in through the window and whisper songs and stories into her sleeping child's ears. One day, When Gwendolyn came in through the window, her child was not on her bed. It was empty. The blanket was folded neatly at the bottom of the bed. She looked under the bed. She wasn't there. She looked in the open drawer. All of her things were gone. She got scared and she ran. She flew through the house desperately crying, "My child, where are you? My child!" But all she found was the widow woman sitting at a table, her head on her hands, softly crying. There was a paper on the table, and Gwendolyn read the human words. "Dear Mother, Melissa safely arrived at college. Love, your son." Gwendolyn had no idea what college was or why the widow woman's son knew where her child was, and she did not. All she knew was her child was gone. And from that night on, her child's window was closed. Several seasons passed. Gwendolyn sat beneath her favorite rose bush. The garden was beginning to come back to life. When her child left, she had lost all interest in her flower fairy duties, and many of the flowers had died. Her sadness began to lift when she started working with the flowers again. The widow woman had suffered through a time of grief and longing also. When she looked out at the flower garden, she realized that many of the flowers had died, and she assumed because she had not been tending the garden. And so she went outside and began working in the garden. And memories of the happy hours she had spent there with Melissa lifted her heart. And so, day by day, side by side, the widow woman and Gwendolyn healed the garden and healed their hearts. One late spring day, Gwendolyn was in the garden, searching to find nasty flower petal eating caterpillars, or flower choking weeds, or even to wobbly stems to support. Instead, she found huge footprints and a stack of papers all rolled up together with an old red hair ribbon that she had found and given to her child long ago. She landed on top of the stack of papers to inspect it, and suddenly she heard a familiar and beloved sound, a laugh coming from the cottage, and she saw that Melissa's window was open, just a crack. As she sprung up and her wings unfurled, her tiny little foot got caught in the bow of the ribbon, and the ribbon untied, and the papers all rolled gently open. Gwendolyn looked down and saw the human writing, and she saw something that made her smile. And she flew off to the cottage, her heart pounding. Now, if Gwendolyn had seen the second page, she wouldn't have been quite as happy, because this stack of papers was actually a freshly printed book manuscript that had been left in the garden as a gift for Gwendolyn. The second page contained the dedication: "To my two mothers, love, Melissa." But the top page is the one that Gwendolyn saw. The page that contained what Gwendolyn knew was the truth. For that was the title page. And the title of the story was The Fairy's Child. I wrote that story 35 years ago for my mother's birthday. I printed it and sent it to her as a gift. 20 years later, my mother became the widow woman. 5 years ago, I found that story and I read it at her funeral. 4 weeks ago, I was awakened in the night by a voice that I'm very familiar with. I've called her my word fairy for 40 years. And she said, "There are fairies in the garden." She would not let me go to sleep until I wrote a poem, and I worked on it for 2 more days about fairies in the garden. Then I got a call to ask me to tell at this program, and I had no idea what to say. Well, she did. She woke me up and said, "Tell my story. It's time." That's the end.